Carroll O'Connor was a huge star both on and off screen, representing one of the most famous series in television history. Despite his notoriety and legendary performance, he clung to a grudge he could never forgive. This is more than simply a difference of opinion or a personality quarrel. Something more profound and individual was at work here. Plus, fans were blissfully unaware of its existence for decades. He refrained from using the name in public thereafter. The final curtain call left no room for doubt. So, what transpired in reality? Who, specifically, was Carroll O'Connor unable to forgive? Get ready to be stunned by the response. You lack intelligence. Brain dead, from the head up, meathead. A slob. Immensely human, yet uncompromisingly set in his ways. He was paired with a younger, more perceptive character who provided the ideal counterpoint to Archie. Their dynamic back and forth was electrifying, not to mention hilarious. The audience was enthralled by their arguments, confrontations, and the surprising moments of kinship. It seemed magical on television. However, what many didn't realize at the time was just how much the characters reflected the mounting tension behind the scenes. They seemed to get along swimmingly in public. During interviews and press appearances, they made light of the situation and complimented one another. However, other crew members have reported feeling an underlying unease between them from the very beginning. There was no explosion. There was no big deal. Still, it was present. According to some, it all started during rehearsals when the two guys started to feel irritated by the artistic decisions made. Some claim it was always an intimate affair. A national spotlight falls on two individuals, each brought up in a separate society, as they attempt to collaborate. One had extensive training in classical acting and had been performing for many years. New life, fiery views, and a sharp tongue were introduced to the program by the other, who was yet in the beginning of his career. Dissimilarities between the two actors were already noticeable before the show took off and became a cultural sensation. They approached things differently, had distinct ends in mind, and had divergent ideas about how the family should evolve. Although they were able to maintain a professional demeanor for a while, there was always an underlying tension between them. What began as a disagreement over ideas would subtly evolve into something far more intimate. Everyone in the family appeared to be running smoothly from the outside. Consistently shattering ratings records while providing chuckles and headlines was its mission. Despite their on-screen chemistry, the two leading guys in the show rarely agreed on anything, and there were plenty of strong opinions and high expectations lurking beneath the surface. Carroll O'Connor was notoriously careful, to the point of obsession. Deep characters, precise timing, and significant storytelling were his beliefs. Every phrase was significant. A reason was behind every halt. He hadn't merely committed scripts to memory. They were improved when he researched them and gave them new forms. Aside from his respect, writers knew he would stand up for what he believed in and not back down if something was off. Adding a new dynamic to the room was his younger co-star, who was bursting with enthusiasm and witty banter. In addition to being more laid back and responsive, he was also far more outspoken about the course he thought the program should go. Carroll vested interest in the show remaining grounded in its character-driven origins, but his co-star was becoming more and more interested in capitalizing on the show. He possessed thoughts that could be expanded upon. Many of them. Sometimes, though, those thoughts ran counter to Carroll's original intent for the program. A member of the crew described an incident in which Carroll requested a rewriting of a scene that they felt was overly simplistic or preachy. However, his co-star was adamant that the script be unchanged. There was a quiet but determined disagreement. Some viewers even noted that the final cut favored the younger actor's tone over Carroll's when the show aired. Carroll saw a trend, however slight it may have been. Those who were there at the beginning say it was modest. It started as casual remarks during table reads and developed into an argument over a line or a joke. At times, Carroll thought his co-star was disrespecting the show's core values or doing worse, changing it into something it never should have been. He was so frustrated with the way the episodes were handled that he vowed to leave the show, though he never actually did so. Still, a lot of people thought they recognized the person he was referring to. Members of the supporting cast, such as Sally Struthers and Jean Stapleton, frequently found themselves at the center of the action, trying to diffuse the tension. Still, there were times when not even they could bridge the gap. Carroll felt strongly about each scene. His rhythm was disrupted when his co-star improvised or played it loose during live tapings. That was absolutely upsetting for someone like Carroll, who put a lot of thought into every beat. Even still, on camera, neither of the men ever showed any signs of weakness. They maintained impeccable time and perfect performances. Some sequences were shot just moments after angry arguments, yet viewers would never have suspected it. There was tension, though. Maturing with the changing of the seasons. Become more protective. He saw his co-star get increasingly vocal. There was a noticeable shift in their interpersonal dynamic, even if they avoided public displays of animosity. What transpired thereafter, however, would elevate the situation from tense to something far more difficult to resolve. The animosity between Carroll O'Connor and his co-star had been building for a long time, but it never really came to a head. Then, what many consider to be the turning point occurred. It was understated, there was no violent altercation or banging of doors, rather, it consisted of a few public remarks that had a profound impact. In an interview, Carroll's co-star was questioned about the significance of the show and the characters they played. There was a change from the initial, mundane reaction. He started to emotionally separate himself from Carroll and, by implication, Archie Bunker. Archie was portrayed by him as dangerous in addition to flawed. Symbolic of an old way of thinking that, in his opinion, deserves neither admiration nor sympathy. Even though it didn't seem like much, Carroll took it personally. Those closest to him claimed he was hurt by it. On a very personal level. While Carroll painstakingly portrayed Archie, the audience saw him as a completely imaginary character. Multiple layers. On purpose. A person. He never considered the protagonist heroic, but he also never considered him villainous. Not a monster, but a mirror, that was Archie Bunker's original intent. It was more than just criticism to hear his co-star go into him like that. It was very disheartening. It got worse when news sources all around the nation ran with the comments. Conflict was reported in the news. Although Carroll refrained from openly retaliating, he was secretly furious. His pals claim he was caught off guard. Particularly because the co-star had gotten his start working with Carroll, capitalizing on Archie's complexities and boundless enthusiasm. It seemed like whatever they had accomplished as a couple was wiped away. The fact that Carroll thought those remarks made it harder to distinguish between the actor and the character was the worst part. Speculation began, subtly but persistently, that Carroll shared Archie's more contentious opinions. Of course, he denied it repeatedly. Unfortunately, it was too late. After the series finished, the subtle gulf between the two men hardened into something more icy, and Carroll bore the brunt of it. Reportedly, Carroll revealed to trustworthy pals that he understood Archie's motivations in private chats. He molded him, and now he treats it like a poison. For a long time, he carried around the guilt of being abandoned to protect the persona. Carroll avoided directly addressing the event even when questioned about it afterwards. However, his demeanor changed as soon as the subject arose. The shift was noticed by friends. Ceased discussing his co-star in public appearances. He became noticeably silent during reunions and retrospectives. No longer did he compliment him, instead, he would compliment authors, producers, and even guest stars. They were both famous because of the show. However, Carroll saw the cost as an irreparably damaged relationship. After the cameras stopped rolling, the hush between them became even more apparent. The conclusion of All in the Family signaled the end of a period. Millions of people had been following the Bunkers for a long time, and they had grown and laughed with them. Carroll O'Connor and her co-star moved in opposite professional and personal ways once the lights went down and the stage deserted. The character of Archie Bunker had a profound impact on Carroll. He remained dedicated even after Archie Bunker took over the show. It was still his belief that stories should be told from a place of raw, painful honesty, even as the world around him was changing. His goal was to make an impression, not become famous. His portrayal of Archie lingered on in his career, even as he branched out into other roles, his most notable being in The Heat of the Night. For better or worse, it was a defining characteristic of his character. At the same time, his on-screen partner suddenly appeared to change his tune. He left performing to focus on directing full-time, serious projects. It didn't take long for him to rise to the ranks of his generation's most illustrious filmmakers. He was the man behind the camera for several critically praised blockbusters. Despite this, Carroll's name was hardly ever brought up in any of the interviews, retrospectives, or documentaries covering his ascent to fame. Notably absent from the narrative was the man who had stood by his side scene after scene. It was painful. When the whole family was recognized at an awards ceremony, Carroll would be sure to give special thanks to Gene Stapleton, Norman Lear, and everyone else who had a hand in making the show what it is today. But he never once mentioned the name of his co-star. Under no circumstances. Omission was not the only factor. It had the air of purpose. Carroll would delicately redirect the subject when reporters wanted to know more. He was always respectful. He was never angry. However, the point was made. There was no making amends, no mutual fondness, and no hospitality. Employees with inside knowledge of the show started talking more freely about the rupture. They referred to it as pride. According to others, there was a basic disagreement in principles. Those closest to Carroll, however, thought it was more fundamental, a feeling of abandonment, of lifting someone up and then forgetting about them once they achieved success. The story became the silence as the years went by. Even though they had worked together to create a television broadcast that would go down in history as a watershed moment, the two men now lived as strangers. However, Carroll would eventually speak up. At last, he spoke his mind when the time was perfect. What he said stunned his fans even more. Many years elapsed. Everything else shifted. Modern television changed with time. Paying customers shifted. Pop inherited the family's traditions and customs. Tradition, past, and present. But certain scars never fully healed for Carroll O'Connor. Even when pressed, he was careful with his word choice when discussing his background. However, the silence that accompanied his recollection of those years was ear-splitting. In the 90s, Carroll was asked during a television interview whether he missed collaborating with his previous cast. Viewers could tell he moved his face ever so slightly. He softly grinned and responded, "Yes, some of them." When pressed further about his frequent on-screen son-in-law, he paused. He praised the boy's performance. There it was. Just the boy, no one to greet him, no comfort. While the average viewer would have thought it was a strange phrase choice, Carroll fans would have understood exactly what it meant. He had no trouble remembering people's names. When he opted not to mention a certain person, it was on purpose. He was methodical and exact. That was his way of expressing that he was speechless. Carroll reportedly still felt deceived, according to acquaintances, but not by anything salacious or criminal, but by something far more personal. He thought his co-star had disrespected the show's central character and, by implication, its main actor by using the entire family as a springboard. In a flash, he was gone. It was as if all the hard work they put into becoming one of the most formidable television duos had been forgotten. Carroll maintained her composure even when appearing on late-night talk shows and attending industry events. To change the subject, he would simply nod courteously whenever the name was brought up. Off camera, he once told a coworker, "There's nothing to be said that I haven't already decided not to say." That was not hatred. He never breached that boundary. Many people's suspicions were eventually validated by a few of his co-workers. What Carroll perceived as a rewrite of their common history was something he could never forgive. Both the respect and the acknowledgement had disappeared. No pride was involved. Legacy was the theme. The show, the persona, and the message were all parts of Carroll's soul. Even more so than most fans anticipated, it was heartbreaking to see someone shrug off his part while walking away from that. Conflicts between professionals or over ideas weren't the only thing that concerned Carroll. It revolved around thankfulness, loyalty, and the feeling of being abandoned at the end of the day. However, he refrained from lash-outs even in his farewell interviews. He withheld crucial details. The stillness he maintained spoke volumes. And that stillness became eternal when the end came. Grace, resilience, and calm contemplation characterized Carroll O'Connor's latter years. His personal tragedies, such as the death of his son, and health problems have gradually diminished his prominence in public life. Fans who had grown up with him continued to look up to him as an inspiration despite everything that happened. Tributes from all corners of the entertainment industry began pouring in when word of his death spread in June 2001. Producers, directors, and actors were all in line to reminisce. The man who had given Archie Bunker such substance was recognized by Gene Stapleton, Norman Lear, and numerous others. However, one voice was conspicuously lacking. The most famous co-star of Carroll's had stayed mum. A number of days elapsed. So, weeks later. Not a single cent. Absent statement. No one will be making an appearance at the burial. The deafening quiet was hard to miss for the many who had hoped for one last act of reverence. The decision, according to some, was an act of private grief. Some people had different opinions. For them, it proved without a reasonable doubt that the gulf between the two men had persisted throughout their lives. Through thick and thin, in this world and the next. A small but meaningful funeral was held, attended by relatives, friends, and even some famous faces from television. Almost everyone who had the pleasure of working with Carroll had nothing but praise for his professionalism, devotion, and generosity. However, as the ceremony progressed, many observers couldn't help but notice the vacant seat that his former co-star may have occupied. A last hug with the past, or an unexpected appearance, was anticipated by some, but it never materialized. Documentaries on All in the Family surfaced years later. These retrospectives examined the show's cultural impact, cast chemistry, and adventurous storytelling. Carroll's impact was recognized and his name was praised. His former co-star avoided him once again. No lengthy commentary was provided by the man who had previously accompanied Carroll in almost every episode, even though others had lauded his dedication, brilliance, and generosity. When asked about their time working together on All in the Family and subsequent interviews, Carroll's ex-co-star used general language, never referring to Carroll by name and failing to provide the tribute fans had hoped for. It lacked anger. It had no sour taste. Nothing was there. The impact of such emotional remoteness was profound. He seems to have discreetly removed those years spent together from the story he wished to tell. It was noticed by the fans. Question sections brimming with comments. What is the reason behind the lack of response? Why is it so frigid? Many people thought the truth was straightforward even though nobody ever said it directly. No one ever got to the bottom of what happened between Carroll O'Connor and his co-star. There was no dramatic outburst or tabloid feud. Neither man could bring himself to correct it. It was something deeper, a fundamental split. Carroll allegedly waited for an unfulfilled apology. There are those who think he accepted the quiet. One thing, nevertheless, is guaranteed. The silent echo of a friendship that had long since gone was all that remained when the time came to say farewell. There was no reunion and no passionate message. Silence, in a sense, spoke louder than words ever could. One of the most recognizable faces in television history was born to the world by Carroll O'Connor. There was more to Archie Bunker than met the eye. Carroll could pour her honesty, fragility, and scathing humor into him, and he was also a lightning rod and a reflection of the times. Whether they liked it or not, millions of people found themselves laughing at him, arguing over him, and maybe even seeing a reflection of themselves in him. Carroll, though, was more than just Archie's wingman. He was a loyal friend and family man, an artist with profound contemplation, and a doting father. Because of that, the breakup with his co-star hurt so much. For both him and everyone who marveled at their magical performances on film. Realness had always been there. Their connection was genuine. The timing was perfect. They brought an unrehearsable performance to life. That is why the subsequent hush was so unexpected. Just absence, no controversy, no explosive interviews, no dramatic feud playing out in the media. Never again did the two men who had performed side by side, known each other's histories, and achieved glory communicate with one another. Kindly, lovingly, absolutely not. Perhaps it is just for that reason that it is so terrible. This was more than just a family narrative, it was about everything in the family. It dealt with individuals attempting to bridge a gap in understanding with one another. Furthermore, no such comprehension was ever achieved in actuality. Carroll omitted his name. Certainly not in speeches, interviews, or even casual conversation. The stillness took his place as he spoke. He may have maintained his pride by doing so. Maybe he was aware that some tales are better kept untold. Carroll O'Connor's unforgiving spirit persisted toward a former co-star with whom he had a spotlight moment and who contributed to the creation of one of the most iconic television series of all time. Still, nothing happened when the lights went out, no handshake, no resolution, no last word. No more than that. Nothing more than silence. The best stories aren't always the ones whose endings we know every detail of.